Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to our show this morning, which was scheduled for discussion of this extraordinary book, For the Love of the Struggle, Memoirs from El Salvador by Andrés McKinley. André has unfortunately been rather unwell recently, and I suspect that's the reason why he hasn't been able to turn up yet. But we do have with us, we have the person who was going to interview and discuss the book with André, Brian Murphy, who is an educator, writer, organizer based here in Ottawa. Brian spent, 30 or so years as part of the staff team of the Canadian social justice organization Inter Pares, which he joined back in 1978. And from an early 1980s, Brian's work included regular extensive visits to El Salvador during and long after the war. And in the course of this period, he met André, and they became friends and have remained so. Brian is now retired, but still an active researcher and blogger on global issues, and a member of the steering committee of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, which he helped to found in 2002. We're very, very lucky to have Brian with us because Brian was responsible indeed for bringing this book to us to consider for publication. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have been able to do so. It's possible that André will turn up in a short while, but in the meantime, let me bring Brian into the conversation. Brian, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Firoz. Good morning,
Brian.
and for everyone else.
Well, indeed, Brian. I mean, you've known André for a long time, and you decided that you would like to recommend this book to us here at Daraja Press. What made you think that? Why did you consider bringing this book to us?
That's an interesting question because I myself was in a situation with Andrés where I didn't want to necessarily bias where he decided to go with his book as a novice writer. The fact that this is Andrés' first book is remarkable because it is so beautiful. But he had sent me the manuscript. And many, many years ago, in the early 2000s, he had started a manuscript. He had started it around the story of Teresa, who had died. And he wrote a piece, which he sent to me. And he said, do you think it's worth me continuing on this road of writing this? And it was a lovely piece. And I said, yes. And your experience, it's team at it. And we were in touch off and on about that, but he was involved in many other things, which are described in the book. And it sounded like it kind of went fallow. And then more or less out of the blue, Anu Yohania had told me that he was working on something. Anu Yohania is also a friend of mine. That's Drew's compañero. This summer, he said, would you look at the manuscript? I finished it. And he sent it to me. I was looking forward to it, but wasn't sure what to expect. And I got it and I was stunned at how good and unique, how the voice of this manuscript. So I wrote him back and I said that you must continue this. And he said, will you help find a publisher? And I said, sure, I'll help do that. And we reviewed ones. And frankly, I have to admit, Daraja was in my mind. but he wasn't aware of Daraja, and there were some other obvious presses that publish important political stuff in states like the one in Boston, and City Lights and whatever. And we explored that, and then I told him about Daraja. And he said, why that one? Just like you did. And I says, well, the word struggle is a big word in the title of your book. And the title is honored through every word of the book. And for me, Daraja is a press that quite uniquely is focusing on people in struggle, people reflecting on their struggle, the history of struggle, the future of struggle. And this book captures all of that. And in some ways, not with the intentionality. There's nothing polemic about it.
But it's remarkable. And I mean, what struck me reading the manuscript was, a story like this could easily be an ego trip.
Yes.
It's about me.
Yeah.
And although one learns a great deal about Andre, what is striking is that he allows us a view into the intimacy of the struggle of the people that he knew, and it's their story.
Yes.
And yet it is also his story, and I think that's an extraordinary achievement. I think very few autobiographers manage to achieve that.
I agree with you, and when we do have a chance to have the conversation, that's part of what I want to talk to him about. For a first-time writer to have been able to do that, and with the voice, and it's not kind of feigned. It's not a false honoring of people. He intermingles subjectivities, his and the people he knows, and often describes them as teachers and mentors of himself. He even does that with the kids in the school that he taught in West Africa. That part of the book, actually, a story I kind of knew, but not the way that he tells it in the book. I'm glad he put that in, and it prepares you so you see the development of a fellow, but without pretense. He just reveals it, and the way he tells the story and the intersubjectivities of him and the people he gets to know and engages in struggle with, and then becomes virtually part of the family in the case of Teresa and Antonio. And at one point I wrote down, I've got it written here on the screen, often something like this, someone's writing a history and they stick characters into it that they knew. And they often even have characters' names. He actually doesn't get into that political history, the geopolitics, until he's so well established people and the real people in their own specificity. You've come to know them. Then he puts history with the people rather than putting people into the history to illustrate it. It is done so respectfully. When I contacted you and said, Feroz, I know this is kind of out of the blue and nobody knows this person, would you take a look at this manuscript? And you did. I was honored that you looked at it so quickly. And afterwards, when you got back and you said, wow, Brian, thank you. We talked about the introductory chapter, the one where he begins with the funeral of Teresa. That chapter that begins and ends with the funeral of Teresa, and in between tells her story and the story of Antonio and their children, and Drew, and Ana Eugenia, is one of the most remarkable things that I have read. It is a perfect sphere, and within it, it captures actually the struggle, and not in a distant way. The struggle. These people didn't get engaged in a struggle that was going on. These people became struggle, and that's what he describes that becoming, and then his own becoming into it. I don't want to overstate it, but it really is amazing.
I mean, I think, Robin Broad, the Guggenheim Fellow, and the director of the Institute of Policy Studies, John Cavanagh, I thought put it really well. I mean, they said that he's penned a beautiful, moving love story, and that is the striking thing about it. It is a love story, in the full sense of that word, and in that sense, a truly human story under most tragic conditions, without penning himself as the hero.
In fact, painting no heroes in a way. He doesn't heroize, make heroes out of the people he's working with.
Well, let me interrupt you there, because we have Andre joining us now, which is just great. Oh, wonderful. Andre, welcome. What a great thrill. How great to meet you at last.
Hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was going with 11 o'clock El Salvador time.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Well, we had an opportunity to celebrate your book behind your back, but now you're here. This is just wonderful.
You're probably lucky that you weren't here. You would have been embarrassed by all the fine words.
So are you both comfortable with us returning to the way we planned this discussion? That it's a discussion between two comrades, two people who've known each other for many years, who've worked together. I propose that, Brian, you take over as the moderator of this discussion, and I will be in the background.
Okay. Firoz, give me 1 minute. I need to put in my hearing thing.
Sure, no problem.
Of all of the eventualities, that wasn't one that I thought of, Feroz, which is crazy because over all of these years, the number of times I have made the mistake of that 1 hour blip, because it only exists during half the year.
Oh, right.
And daylight saving, we're on the same time frame, and you get used to it, and then you forget.
Okay, well, let me once again speak to our listeners, our viewers, to say that we're very pleased that we have Andrés McKinley, the author of For the Love of the Struggle, Memoirs from El Salvador. And what we will be doing now is handing over to Brian Murphy to discuss with André this extraordinary, really quite extraordinary book. So welcome, André, once again. It's a real pleasure to meet you at long last, even if virtually.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you all, and I'm very sorry for the confusion on the hour.
No problem at all. I'm just thrilled that you're here. Brian.
And I'm going to launch into it a little quicker the days that I was, because I was, when you were away, I did my own homage to the book, and we explained. Feroz asked how it was that I brought this manuscript to him to consider for Daraja. So our audience actually has heard a little bit about that. And I thought I'd launch right in with, we've already explained, obviously, this is a book not only that we admire greatly, but think it's imperative that it gets out there. Later on, you may be talking about the Spanish language version that's in the works. And I think it's wonderful that this book is going to be available in Spanish as well. Closing off the street. So I thought we'd just launch right into the motivation for the book. Early on, I'm just going to read from the book, just very, very shortly. You talk about, this is in the note to the reader, so very, very early on. And you talk about the fact that you had come to a point where you felt you had not shared adequately the human experience of a war that had bled my adopted country and changed me forever. I had been unable to bring to life the personal histories of its heroes and martyrs, and I had been unable to record more faithfully the hopes and aspirations that pulled me into their struggle. This book was born from the desire to meet this challenge. Could you expand on that a little bit, about the motivation for writing the book, the motivation that kept you at it? It's a remarkable book. I don't think it could have been easy to read. We're going to talk about that process next. But could you expand a little bit on the motivation?
Well, my experience in El Salvador, especially during the war years, and given the unfortunate role that my own government was playing in that situation, I found myself with an increasingly profound anger towards my country of origin, towards friends of my youth, and towards my own family, because I was frustrated at what I saw as a passive response in the face of this enormous tragedy that was going on in El Salvador. And the people that I love most in this on this earth were in some ways victimized by that anger and that ire. I start my book off with a very sad letter from my mother that I came upon years after the war, and realized how much she suffered because of my involvement in El Salvador during those years, how much she was struggling to hold on to a son who apparently was moving away from her and my brothers and sisters. So, I've had this debt to those that I most love, to try to explain the emotional elements that were affecting me at that time, try to explain in a more intelligent way as well the reasons for that, the reasons for my anger, the reasons for my deception and frustration with my country of birth, and try to bring us together again in that knowledge and understanding of how our lives had taken a different path. That's one of the primary reasons for writing this book, a debt to the people that loved me, who I loved, and who suffered along with me during those years. There are other reasons, however, for writing this book. It's a story that I felt it needed to be told, especially with regards to figures in the book like Antonio and Teresa Rivas, who don't have a voice to tell the story of their own lives. So this book was an effort on my part to tell their story because, like I say, to me, it's a story that needs to be told. But those are personal reasons. There's a more objective reason for having written this book and for having pushed to finalize it in the current context of El Salvador, and that is the need to remember, the need for the younger generations of El Salvador and of the world to understand that period in El Salvador, perhaps one of the most important, troublesome, difficult, and at the same time, amazing, enlightening periods in the history of El Salvador. We have a government in power right now who is essentially trying to make people forget the past, forget history. It's a bizarre, almost demonic effort to establish that history begins with the current president of El Salvador. You know, he questions all that went on in this country before taking power. So that's a need, an urgent need at another level, you know, to remember history, to document history, to tell a story again, obviously in my own eyes and through the eyes of those who I knew during those periods about the history and its importance, along with the martyrs and the heroes of that period.
Well, in my view, you certainly have achieved that, and we really want to see this book get out. I've told you privately, when I received the manuscript from you, I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought I would like it. I thought I would enjoy it. I'd seen parts of it years and years earlier, and we had some discussion about what you might do, but then there was a interlude. You didn't stop working. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process, the history of that writing, how it began, and what is brought to this now, being able to put this all together so completely with incredible craft.
Thank you, Brian. This book was written as a result of two horrible periods in my life. You know, during my 44 years now in El Salvador, I've been quite active in social causes with no time to write, with little time to reflect on the past and accomplish the goals and objectives that I just laid out to you a few minutes ago. But in 2002, I had a horrible motorcycle accident and broke my back and was inactive in terms of social struggles for over a year. And that was an opportunity, you know, they say out of hardship comes opportunity. That was an opportunity to think first, to think about this project, reflect intensely with my companion, my life companion, Ana Eugenia, who helped me sort of lay out the issues that I wanted to describe in the book. And it was an opportunity to sort of order my files. I had a diary from my times in the war zones of El Salvador, so I could go through that more slowly. order my thoughts, and begin to write. So I spent that year writing intensively, rewriting intensively, consulting with people, going back to historical documents, trying to collect documents that would be useful to have in the book, because I want to be sure, that this book is based on historical reality, historical truth. So I need to be able to document that adequately. And so that in that period between 2002 and 2003, really, I made enormous advances in terms of putting together sections of this book. Obviously, the latter chapters that I've written for the book had not occurred at that time. The second horrible moment in life for all of us has been the pandemic. And we were quarantined radically here in El Salvador for extended periods of time. And given my age and all, I've had restricted movements in the face of the COVID pandemic. So there was another opportunity. I said to myself early on, I'm going to dedicate myself during this time to trying to finish this project. So that I did, again, with the constant support and processes of reflection and analysis of Ana Eugenia, who read my drafts 4 or 5 times in English, and now she's read it several times in Spanish. And with important support from a number of different human beings, individuals, actors, documents, sources of information here in El Salvador and outside.
Okay. You told me about the heroic contribution of Ana Eugenia. Our audience should know that I didn't just stumble across Andrés. I was introduced to Andrés by Ana Eugenia. Ana and I were spent years together working in a international consortium in support of internally displaced people and refugees in Central America. And it was through Ana that I met Andrés. In your book, Andrés, I hope you won't be, or she won't be embarrassed by me quoting you. You say, Ana would offer tolerance and understanding of my ignorance of her culture and help me fall in love with her country and with her people through her eyes and her heart. I was moved by that because she had the same effect on me, falling in love with El Salvador. And then I could just imagine all these years later going through those editing processes. I think you told me she edited it about 5 times, but she also helped you frame it. And the way you describe your relationship with Ana is typical of the way you describe, even maybe not describe, tell your relationships with so many Salvadoran people. I was saying before you came on that one of the things that amazes me about the book is the intersubjectivities. When you are talking about your life and the life of the people you are working with, your subjectivity and their subjectivity are not me and them. It's us. And you reveal yourself through describing them and reveal them through describing your relationship. You often refer to some of these folks, including Teresa and Antonio notably, as mentors, as teachers, as people who took you in their hands and helped you see, helped you into struggle. in the process of writing, did that style, that voice just flow, or did you have to work very, very hard to achieve it?
No, it came natural. This book is not about a North American who comes to El Salvador and gives everything he had to Salvador and the Salvadoran people. This is a book about someone who was lucky enough to show up on the doorstep of El Salvador, like I said earlier, at a very critical moment in the country's history and in the political, social, religious, cultural evolution of El Salvador. It's a story of receiving. It's not a story of giving. I've always felt blessed by being in this country, living in this country, in spite of the difficulties in the struggles that one had to confront. It's been a blessing. It's been a time of transition for me. I equate it, I say this in the book, to salvation. It's not it's not unusual, or we shouldn't be surprised at the fact that all of this transformation in my person, this growth, took place in a country whose name is the Savior, El Salvador. So that's what the book is about, not because I was forcing myself to think in those terms, but in trying to describe the experience with honesty and objectivity. That's the way it was. That's the way it continues to be today. I was blessed also to have the opportunity to begin my process by seeing El Salvador through the eyes of somebody like Ana Eugenia. She was somebody who obviously loved her people. He loved El Salvador, with head and heart, ready to give all at that key moment in history to this country. So that was an opportunity for me to see, to understand this country through that shining person who acted really as a guide for me during all of those years. And I'm sorry, I get a little still emotional when I talk about it, but it was a love affair in every sense of the word.
Thank you for that. There's a very, the moment in the book before you come to Salvador, you describe a conversation in which at a distance, you're not even in Central America at the time, and you're trying to work out what's next. And Anna says, "Just come home." That's a beautiful part of the book where you describe that. The construction of the book is we're talking to potential readers, and I think it's important for them to understand that when they read this book, they actually are going to find it a different experience from an autobiography in its in what I call its craft, the diligence with which you put it together. And I found the construction of the book very deft, that we hear the stories at the very beginning. There's a long section, a charming section, where we get to know you through the school children and the villages where you are living in West Africa as a teacher with Peace Corps. And we don't read that as a preamble to the real act. It is a story in itself that evolves. And you move that story from West Africa to the streets of America, the United States, where you did street social work and things. Then the intense period around Guatemala, and the coming to El Salvador. And it's only, I think, chapter 4, as I recall, that you take a breather and actually give us a bit of a history lesson. You don't tell us the history and then stick people in it. You introduce us and have us grow with you and with other people that we know. And then there's an intense part where actually you lay out the geopolitics of the situation you are now finding in the crucible at its critical nexus point of struggle. Did you think that through? Did you revise it? It must have been very tempting to tell the history and then say, and here we were. But it's not like that. It's a story.
Well, you know, I decided to do that chapter. It's entitled "The Roots of Rebellion."
That's right.
To help people understand why citizens in El Salvador and why I, as a person, were making certain decisions about, you know, how to dedicate our lives, how to focus our efforts. And there were major issues, of course, that come up in the book related to those decisions. The whole question of political violence and what does that do to you when you see it and feel it and see people that you love being affected by it, and what are the decisions that you make in the face of that reality. You know, the people in El Salvador didn't just jump into a violent conflict and decide to take part on one side or another. There's a whole history that explains how poor peasant farmers, for example, or jobless workers or students who have seen their university closed by the military, women who are being abused on the street by security agents, how church workers who, because of their belief in the words of Jesus regarding love for your neighbor and regarding the issues of social justice, because of the evolving positions of the Catholic Church in Central America as a whole, in terms of what we refer to as liberation theology, which lays out a whole new way of thinking about sin, with a greater emphasis and focus on social, structural sin rather than individual sin. Recognizing that the poor of this earth are the preferred of God, and making that special option to dedicate yourself to the poor. All of these things that I'm mentioning were elements that influenced the historical process and the decisions that people made. There are those who question people who opted for violence. Many of us opted for the revolutionary struggle without any intention or particular desire to be violent. Many of us went into that struggle out of love, out of a heartfelt desire to end the suffering of so many people in this country, recognizing the failures of, you know, decades and decades to bring about change through nonviolent ways, watching electoral fraud and watching military dictatorships refused to recognize the results of elections, watching the levels of repression against citizens growing in the country of El Salvador, but also in neighboring countries like Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, etc. It was just a decision to do something in a historical context to eliminate that suffering. So to understand that process is not easy. To explain it is not easy. My intention was never to write a history book, but the history is important. The historical context, the political context is important to understand the decisions that people were making. And of course, in the latter part of the book, there's a recognition, you might call it, of the fact that, the violence of a military struggle, which so many of us were involved in for years, didn't bring about the kinds of changes that we needed for El Salvador. There's a recognition here, I would say, among almost all Salvadorans, that violence begets violence. And there's this enormous emphasis, beginning with the end of the war through the formal signing of peace accords in 1992. There's this emphasis on finding alternatives to violent struggle. So if you read the book, you will see clearly that transition of people coming out of a violent struggle, sometimes military struggle, and beginning to opt with an insistence, an exaggerated level of insistence on a non-violent struggle. And so what from 1992 on, up until this present day, what guides all of us in terms of an underlying principle to bring about change in El Salvador is this commitment to non-violent struggle.
Gwen, you've actually described that chapter very well. The way your writing goes into it, and then how the story then comes back out of it. And I think of I think I even mentioned to you, there's describing that process, and you just did it with great passion. You write about it with a restraint. It's not romanticized, it's not heroized, it's described with compassion, but a restrained intensity. And I found as I was reading it, that somehow you leave, in describing all of that, there's also the unsaid. And that unsaid leaves room for the reader to think and feel. I think, for example, the one that sticks in my mind is the story of Rutilio Grande, which actually you tell that story, I believe, before the chapter you just mentioned. And Teresa and Antonio were parishioners in the base community that Rutilio Grande created before his assassination. And that whole section on that beginning within the parish of Rutilio Grande, the Jesuit, it left me, and I think it will leave the reader, in wonder at the courage and determination of Rutilio Grande himself, but the courage and determination of the peasant. And it's impossible to read that without wondering, would I have been so brave? What conditions would I have to be living in to generate such courage? And of course, in your story, courage is the other face of fear. In the lack of fear, there is no courage. What conditions would prompt such courage? Would I have been so brave? Is the question that came up as I was reading. Um, do you think that will be a common experience? Was it your experience as you met these people, wondering what could make you so brave? Could you just comment on my reflection that your story you tell is restrained, and it engages me, I think, in a way that if you made it more dramatic, I would have started to objectify.
I never, when I was living those years, I never thought about it in terms of being brave or not being brave. What was clear to me was a question of alternatives. There was simply no alternative. You had this mass of landless peasants who were literally starving to death, watching children die from a lack of sufficient resources to buy medicines for simple illnesses that could be cured easily under different circumstances. Watching innocent peasants and urban slum dwellers being repressed, carried away at night by death squads who were acting as an instrument to try to dissuade any possible commitment on the part of citizens to dedicate themselves to efforts for nonviolent change. You had the situation of Antonio himself forced to cut sugarcane, which is one of the most difficult labors that you can imagine in your life, under a hot, burning sun, cutting cane all day for 15 cents a day, in order to complement inadequate wages that he earned working on a large hacienda. And then watching the owners of those plantations refuse to pay even the 15 cents a day that the workers were legally entitled to. There wasn't a sense of bravery in my mind, like I say, around those issues. There was no alternative. I mean, I just understood it as the most logical process you could imagine. What could be more logical than landless peasant farmers in desperation and deciding for, in terms of the survival of their families, deciding to take measures to try to modify those conditions that they're living under. I mean, what alternative could you see there? To me, I guess you can see it in terms of bravery, because they certainly knew, all of them, that they could easily die, and many were, as in the case of Rutilio Grande himself. That was always an obvious reality, but people, the life that they were living was the closest element to death you could imagine on earth. They're physically alive and all, but they're living under conditions that it certainly don't qualify as life or life sustaining, if you will. So there were no alternatives, and the military was strengthening always its presence in the countrysides, along with the police forces. Again, unfortunately, my own government was involved in strengthening the military and training and strengthening and providing weapons to the security forces of El Salvador, ignoring all of the historical root causes when campesinos, when landless peasants decided to rise up against the status quo.
Okay. As your story goes along, for me, a real turning point there's a long stretch of the story when you go to the mountains. You incorporate within the armed forces of the FMLN, doing community development work with peasants in the controlled zones. And a turning point for me is the massacre at Copapayo, where, and you don't make a big thing of it, but your role changes. You're asked to do something which I think was very difficult. And there was a terrible massacre at Copapayo, which you agreed to go with another person through the zones to Copapayo and document what had happened there while the flies were still buzzing, if I may put it that way. Two questions. One is, you, and I assume Feroz, have chosen to put fairly graphic images of the photos you took at Copapayo. And you documented it with interviews and with those photos, and then actually trekked out of the controlled zones and took them to the Tutela Legal. And the photos in your testimony was a turning point in the war. You've chosen to include some of those images in the book, and I'd like to know what thought process you went through, whether you had hesitation, what that process was, but also then about that moment in your participation in these processes. When you went to Copapayo, you did what you had to do there, which is described in the book, trekked out and helped bring these images, this proof to the world of what the US-supported military was doing in the country. So there's two questions there. I wonder if you could talk about it.
Well, just to clarify, I was very close to Copapayo when that massacre occurred. I didn't go into the zones in order to document that massacre. I was already there, and I was asked by FMLN leadership to go and document this massacre because the U.S. Embassy was insisting that it didn't occur. The U.S. Embassy was insisting that this was, terrorist propaganda, communist propaganda, in an effort to discredit the security forces who were being trained by the United States. And to discredit the current government and the government at that time in El Salvador. So it was an important event to cover and document with evidence. I took photos. I was. It was the moving experience, obviously showing up in an area where you could see that hundreds of civilians had been killed. You could see where the initial confrontation between the Atlacat battalion trained by United States Special Forces had opened fire on a unarmed civilian population. You could see the bags of peasants thrown everywhere, little children, slippers, dolls, letters, games the little children in the countryside play with, thrown all over the hillsides where the first part of that massacre occurred. Then I was carried to a small house in a nearby village of San Nicolas, where people from the area had been afraid to go into, and they all looked with their mouths open when I pushed through the door and went into that chamber of horrors in order to document the number of women and children, or the cadavers that were still left, half eaten by the buzzards. Document that, and was then carried to a nearby hillside where older men and boys had been massacred. It was important to, have that evidence, and I felt important to put it in my book. There were people who advised against that, against having these graphic pictures in my book, but I decided to do it in an effort not to leave any question in the minds of readers. Um, about what had occurred. That was one of the more dramatic, massacres that I was asked to document. But I was also present throughout my times in the liberated zones when massacres of civilians took place. And I don't show all the pictures of those, and I don't even talk in detail about all of those events. It gets repetitive when you're trying to write a story of this nature. I found myself writing the same things about every visit into the liberated zones because the same kinds of phenomena were occurring. But it was basically the basic underlying phenomena that was occurring throughout the years that I was visiting the liberated zones was innocent civilian populations being bombed or massacred in an attempt to drive them out of their villages of origin so that the army could bomb without restraint those areas.
I agree with the decision you made, and one as witness, and I don't think it's excessive. Again, I thought your description of those events and your participation in them was restrained, but it also gave such meaning to other processes that you described later on. I believe that happened in '83. And we can jump forward to the beginning of the return and repatriation processes. And Feroz, if you wanted to be ready with a few of the photos that I provided with you, in March of '87, Ana Eugenia and I went up the highway to Suchitoto and went across the lake, accompanying and bringing supplies to the refugees from Mesa Grande, from Copapayo, who had fled, many in advance of the massacre because they could sense what was coming in '83. And now, in a process you described in the book, 4 years later, these folks take control of their lives, but also insert themselves in a political process in a way that was audacious, that many advised them not to do, and many warned them not to do. And so, in a lovely March day in '87, this is Ana right in the middle, handing off so to the fellow in the red and white hat. Ana Eugenia. I'm taking the picture. I'd already gotten out of the boat and had quite a soaker, not being moment in the context of the history you just told about the massacre and the process that led to when you went to San Salvador with the details, and some years later, you described this in the book. There are a few other photos there, Feroz, if you want to just go through them. These are the folks are bringing the supplies up from the lake. They're just beginning to rebuild hovels. You can see the damage is still there that they reconstructed. And I think there's one last photo I put in here for just kind of romantic purposes. That's Guasapa. In the book, you'll hear a lot about Guasapa, and Andres has mentioned Guasapa. This is Guasapa from, that's later on, Feroz. Just go back to Guasapa. So I assume Andres, that in fact you walked across this terrain on that horrible day when you did the witnessing. Could you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that happened after the massacre and other massacres were made public, and the struggle started to turn, that could lead to a repatriation like this, people coming back from Honduras, taking on a new subjectivity and struggle?
Yeah. Well, the idea of driving the civilian population out of these areas was always a key part of the war strategy of the United States and of the Salvadoran military. They described this strategy in terms of drying up the sea to kill the fish. They recognize looking at the guerrilla organizations as the fish, looking at the civilian population as the sea, in recognizing that the fish cannot live without the sea. It was a very real truth that the guerrilla organizations could never have survived in El Salvador without the continual intense support of the civilian population. The civilian population provided food, they provided intelligence information, they provided recruits. They were quiet, silent about the location of guerrilla camps when military troops, when government troops came through the areas. They were just absolutely essential. And I spent much of my time with those civilian populations. I was always just absolutely amazed at this, firm, strong, supportive, stoic population who had lost so much and who was willing to continue giving to this effort. The time certainly came, and I began to notice it in my own travels around 1984, that civilians began to find it increasingly untenable to continue to reside in the war zones of El Salvador. In the areas that I moved in, you could call them the most, they were some of the most heavily, well, there was heavily repressed areas in the country with government troop incursions every 2 weeks, with the aerial bombing taking place every day, sometimes 3 times a day. We used to joke that the bomber planes came every morning looking for the cook fires for breakfast, and they came every afternoon looking for signs of smoke for lunch, and they came every evening looking again for signs of smoke for dinner. So we called that the morning, the breakfast, lunch, and dinner ration of bombing every day. That made life almost impossible to sustain for civilian population, and there was a period of time in which they began to move out of the zones where I was primarily in, because, like I say, they were some of the most highly contended war zones in the country. They moved to more controlled zones like Chalatenango in the north, or into church refugee centers in the capital city, and often into UN-run centers in Honduras. But it's an amazing phenomenon when you think that by 1985, primarily 1986, these populations began to return. They couldn't stay out of their villages of origin. They were adamant about their right to live in their villages of origin. There was also this underlying sense of, we're needed. We need to be in our country at this historical moment. And many of their sons and daughters were guerrilla fighters, so they needed to be in those communities. So they began to come home, and they began to come home with the bullets still flying. This might be one of the few examples in the world of civilian populations who return to their village of origin under fire, with the war still going on. But they began to repopulate, some individually, just coming quietly back into the zones, to resettle their communities. Others in medium scale organized efforts to repopulate, and others in large scale, especially the refugees from the camps in Honduras came back, in large groups. So we're talking about, 5,000-6,000 people coming at a time and resettling in different parts of the war zones of El Salvador. This process, obviously, given the fact that displacing the population was such a key part of the military strategies of the U.S. and of the Salvadoran government, was heavily resisted by the authorities. The army resisted the return of these people. In the case of Copapayo, when the first group of people who had been displaced in '83, when that first group returned, they came across the lake. That photo that you show with Ana distributing aid to people on the shores of Lake Suchitlang is the same place where they left from in 1983. It's the same place where they were ambushed by the Atlacat Battalion in 1983. So there's this heroic event in which they come across the lake in the same launches that they had tried to flee in 1983 to resettle by force their communities in Copapayo, San Nicolas, and other communities nearby. In the case of Copapayo, the first group that came back were stopped halfway through their journey. They made it across the lake to a large town called Suchitoto. They were gathered in the church in Suchitoto, making plans, getting ready to take the last few kilometers or last few miles to the original site of Copapayo, and they were surrounded by the military and held there for a week. So the repression and the resistance on the part of security forces continued in the face of these efforts of civilian populations to demand their right established in the Geneva Convention to reside in their communities of origin, regardless of how seriously the war is around them.
Your book deals very well with that period and the various forms of organizing outside the controlled zones, among the popular organizations or among the base communities, working to struggling towards some kind of process that could bring peace. I want to jump forward and Feroz, just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump past the part where we were going to talk a little bit about the demobilization and the support for the demobilization and leading up to the peace accords. But there's much in your book that happens around the peace accords, and there's reflections on the hopes and dreams and fears around the peace accords. And there's also the last section of the book where you describe tremendous organizing that happened. It's a part of Salvador's history that has kind of been left behind. 1992, war's over, Reconstruction, and kind of the world's gaze turned. Can you describe a little bit, as you do in your book, the feeling of yourself, the people that you were working with, and when the peace accords were signed, and you were moving into a period of reconstruction? And then we'll touch briefly on the fascinating last section, the work around mining, whatever. So describe 1992, 1993, as you do in your book, the hopes, the dreams, the fears.
Brian, there's a problem with the connection, I think. You fade out. And then I lose the visual image. Can you just quickly repeat that question?
Did you miss it all?
You were talking about the period after the signing of peace.
That's right. And you describe the anticipation, the efforts to try to capture that peace, to also build justice, and the experiences of the people who have been very involved in the war time, what happened after, and the kind of organizing that evolved that eventually led to almost 2 decades of work in this century around mining and water and other things.
Yeah. It's important to understand that the peace accords, although they put an end to the military component of the struggle in El Salvador, the political component continues today. The battle to promote 2 very different agendas. Many of us, on the one hand, were trying to assure that the application of the peace accords helped resolve many of the underlying causes of the war. We were thinking in terms of empowering the poor, both economically, socially, politically. We were thinking in terms of guaranteeing economic equality or greater economic equality in the country, thinking in terms of programs that would eradicate poverty for El Salvador. Whereas other forces, including the United States, the Salvadoran government, were thinking in more macroeconomic terms of, how to make El Salvador look better in macroeconomic terms, how to enable it to be able to pay off its debts, for example, over the long term. They weren't interested in really producing any underlying social or economic change in the country. It's important to understand that the FMLN, while it had enough force and we had decided to fight on until winning the struggle initially, eventually had to accept the fact, along with the Salvadoran government and the US, that they didn't have the ability to win the war decisively. I mean, the United States began to recognize that the Salvadoran military and government could never win this war decisively. The FMLN had to recognize that as well. And they simply did not have the political force at the time of the signing of peace to insist on the kinds of peace accords in the area of social and economic change that would assure the advance of the kinds of agendas that we were all hoping for. What the peace accords clearly did attain is changing the political reality of El Salvador in terms of democratization. It reduced the size of the army from 60,000 to 17,000 troops. It modified the role of the army so that it would no longer involve itself in internal security issues. Of course, that's being modified now in modern times, where you see the army out in the streets again, patrolling for internal security reasons. It modified the role of the police, it put it under civilian rule. It legalized the FMLN as a legal political party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were a number of steps that were taken to democratize El Salvador, which were important, which clearly changed the face of this nation in political terms. But all the social and economic aspects that we were all hoping for in order to alleviate poverty, in order to generate mass opportunities for the sectors of Salvadoran society who were most affected by Salvadoran reality in the 1960s and 1970s, the victims, let's say, of those years didn't take place. So, I mentioned earlier in this interview that you can see a clear transition with the end of the war and with the struggles that followed in order to develop this agenda in social and economic terms that could produce meaningful change in El Salvador. You can see this undying commitment to nonviolence, to peaceful means. And, there were lots of issues to pick from in terms of continuing the struggle in El Salvador during those years. I got more involved in environmental issues because I began to understand that no other issue, no other problem in El Salvador is as strategic as the environment. This is a country that suffers from water stress. There's not enough water for the population. It's a country that is extremely deforested. Some people consider it the most deforested country in the Western Hemisphere. It's a country whose natural resources are all in crisis. And of course, we understood that sustainable development without environmental concerns is not possible. So we began to dedicate our efforts and our focus on environmental issues. The first one to come up was the mining issue, the most urgent in an effort to save water. I might add, before getting involved in that issue, I got involved in a training program in Central America in public policy advocacy, which was perceived as an alternative to violent struggle. We knew that the citizenship of El Salvador, as well as other countries in Central America, had to remain engaged, involved, if we were to consolidate these incipient democracies that were being developed around the region. That citizen participation with concrete, clear agendas for change would have to be an important element in that process. So I got involved in this beautiful training program to strengthen the ability of civil society organizations around Central America. Also had the opportunity to travel to the United States, to Belize, and to Africa as part of that effort, and to South America. But the point that I want to make is it provided me with tools for nonviolent struggle. It's one thing to talk about a commitment, to nonviolent struggle, but we needed a tool based on active citizen participation at all levels of the society that was nonviolent. That was public policy advocacy. So that was, something that I could bring to the struggles of the future in El Salvador, beginning with mining.
And that's a photo, incidentally, to the audience of Andres and a very good colleague of ours, Johanna Aberle. Anna is hidden a little bit behind the fellow we're speaking to. And that picture was taken in early 1992 when we were doing an investigation and lobbying effort to try to get international support for the demobilization centers of the FMLN, which were languishing at the same time as the talks were going on and put the peace at risk. So thanks for putting that photo up. We're going to have to move on. Andres, I have to say the last section of the book that you just described, post-war, and it stares reality in the eye. It's not romanticized. It admits the difficulties and even failures of some of the hopes and dreams that went by. But it also showed that it wasn't an ending, that the legacy of struggle, the things that were learned in struggle, continued on. And that section in the 21st century, right up to the present and to the historic decision in around mining in, I believe it was 2017, is a part of the book that I think readers who are expecting to get a story only about the war, they're going to learn a lot more about Salvador, which I think was part of your goal. Feroz, I wondered in ending whether anything came up that you want to observe or ask in this conversation. Otherwise, Drew, this has just been such a pleasure.
It's been an extraordinary discussion. It's a really, really throwing real light on the level of commitment that you clearly exhibited throughout your life. As I understand it, the elections are coming up in El Salvador. I wonder if you give us some sort of understanding of what to expect in this, with FMLN also presenting candidates for the legislature. Could you give me some idea of what that looks like?
Well, legislative and municipal elections are going to be held on December, on Sunday, on the 28th of this month. We have a number of concerns about the political context that these elections are taking place in. We have a new president who's been in power a year in El Salvador, and during that time has demonstrated a certain tendency towards authoritarianism. He's very confrontational with political parties of the opposition, with the independent news media, with any social force that he perceives as being part of the opposition. He has demonstrated a tendency to ignore the laws of El Salvador, to ignore the calls from the Supreme Court to take certain measures. He demonstrates a tendency to have little respect for the distinction among the three major powers of government, the legislative, judicial, and executive branch. And the elections on Sunday are a clear attempt on his part, or he has clearly the hope of winning a majority in the National Assembly. If he wins a majority for his party in the National Assembly, then we're not going to have a separation of powers that is operative between the legislative and the executive branches. And that lack of questioning or the lack of sort of watchdog function that the National Assembly should play with the executive branch will be eliminated, and will allow the executive branch to also put in power in the judicial branch, judges and members of the Supreme Court that are favorable to him. So obviously what this begins to look like to us is the formation of a totalitarian, anti-democratic government that runs the risk of pulling us back into the same kinds of political conditions that gave rise to the war in the 1970s and 1980s. The current government, the current executive also took, if you look at it from one standpoint, you could say intelligent steps early on in his government to put the police force and the military in his pockets. He's been very good to the military and to the police in economic terms, raising their salaries, giving them bonuses, guaranteeing all of the modern equipment that they need. So, they're very united to the current day president. And in fact, there have been moments in which the head of the national police in El Salvador has come out, and the Minister of Defense as well have come out expressing their allegiance to the president, not to the Constitution, not to the state, but to the president. So, all of these things are worrisome for us. Unfortunately, or strangely, like populist presidents in other countries of the world today, the current president has enormous amounts of support from the population. There's a whole reflection you could make on that issue. Why is it that the majority of the population is not as concerned as many of us are for democratization, for respect for institutionality? They're more impressed with the fact that the president or his people show up on their doorstep with a package of food or medicine, the immediate help. So it's a delicate moment. I don't want to try to guess about where this is going to take us, but it smells wrong. It reminds many of us of the tendencies that existed in the 60s, in the 70s, and we're concerned that this can pull us back into a political situation in which we begin to find few alternatives for generating social and economic change in El Salvador.
Finally, I'd just like to say that we're looking forward to seeing the Spanish edition of your book, which I gather is being edited by John Sobrino. When do we expect the book to come out?
Well, hopefully during my lifetime. It's been a slow process. It's been a slow process. It's going to be published by UCA Editores, the publishing arm of the UCA. Unfortunately, there are a number of big names in the UCA who have books already in line to be published, so this is sort of holding up my edition. But we're finalizing now the Spanish translation, and I'm confident within the next few months that the book will be published by the UCA.
Great.
Feroz, do you still have
Yes.
the slide show up?
Yep.
Andres was asking me if I had a photo of Anu Henia on our adventures, that he's looking for photos for the Spanish version. It's just a little further up. There's a photo of Anna. I think it's right near the end. Drew, this was when we were, there she is. This was when we were investigating the concentration points for the demobilized. An ongoing part of the education that Anna gave me. So I'll send this photo to you for the Spanish language version.
Yeah, you see how cute she is. How could you not follow that?
Yeah. And you notice the bag in her hand. That was my bag that you used to call the agency bag. Brian's agency bag. It's been great.
Anna has always liked to carry big bags.
Yeah.
Well, Andres, I'd like to thank you very much for sparing time to talk to us about your book and your experiences. It's been throws an incredible light on what I think is an extraordinary book, a book about love, and I think to combine love and struggle in the same phrase is essential for our futures. So let me express our thanks from Daraja Press. Brian, thank you for moderating this excellent conversations. And we'll be putting both the video and the audio version of this discussion on our website shortly. So just like to say thank you for joining us on the show, and wish you well, and we'll be in touch again soon. Go well.
Thank you very much to both of you. Have a
Thank
great
you,
day.
Andres.
Bye. Thank you for joining us on this show, and we will be back again next week.